The 9th and 10th of November this year mark the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, when Nazi authorities unleashed a series of vicious pogroms against Jewish communities in Germany and Austria. This infamous event was to be called Kristallnacht because of the shattered glass of the Jewish shops, businesses, and other buildings which were attacked. Synagogues in areas across Nazi control were desecrated and in many cases destroyed. Even in countries abroad, where anti-Semitism was prevalent, there was outrage as the details of Kristallnacht emerged. Kristallnacht, though, did not occur in a vacuum, instead being an outgrowth of the systematic discrimination, intimidation, and violence practiced against Jews since the Nazi Party rose to power in 1933. The spurious, immediate excuse for this infamy was the assassination of a Nazi diplomat in Paris by a Polish Jew. In addition to the destruction and vandalism, around 30,000 Jewish men were arrested simply for being Jewish and sent to concentration camps. The Jewish community was fined an astronomical sum, clearly intended to punish and humiliate it further. In 2013, the late Eli Fachler of blessed memory, who grew up in Berlin before escaping to the UK and serving in the British Army, eventually moving to Israel later in life, spoke movingly to the Conference of European Rabbis when that organization held its biannual conference at the rebuilt Berlin Rabbinical Seminary. As a child, Eli had attended the shul there and witnessed the events of Kristallnacht. Sadly, Eli is no longer with us. We are very grateful to Rabbi Yossi Fachler, one of his sons, who is a widely popular educator and most recently served as interim rabbi at the New West End Synagogue in central London, for joining us today to share some of his father's reflections about Kristallnacht and, given the current awful situation in Israel, some contemporary reflections too. So Rabbi Fachler, thank you very much for joining us. In opening, please, could you please tell us about your father's background and what he witnessed on Kristallnacht?
Hi, Rabbi Laitner. Thank you. My father, Eli Fachler, his parents fled Poland after World War I because they didn't feel safe there. Many Jews fled Poland, Lithuania after World War I, thinking the safe bet is Germany because World War I was over. No way is Germany going to cause any more trouble. And many other Eastern European Jewish communities moved to Germany. Most of the Ashkenazi Hasidic went to Berlin. The Lithuanians went to Frankfurt, but there was also a bit of mixture. And that was straight after the war. So my father in 1923, in October, was born in Berlin. His sister was born 4 years later. That is my auntie Miriam, who is still alive and living in Jerusalem, but more about her later. And he grew up in Berlin in the Adass community, which was mainly ex-Polish Lodz Jewish members. And they had their own shul where his uncle was the president and his father was the reader, the Baal Koreh. So my father, basically, the shul was his home. It was right next to his house, across the road from the flat. And he lived a very, very wonderful, sheltered, Orthodox life with many of the other Adass members in the road and in the area, including family Borg, who would later, Yosef Borg would be the interior minister for about 17 different Israeli governments, which nowadays lasts 1 year, but in those days lasted many decades, amongst other families. And they were pretty much safe in their Jewish environment, all the way up to and including 1933, when Hitler came to power.
Wow. So your father was born, grew up in Berlin, and I suppose had his bar mitzvah in Berlin as well. So he was really, as a teenager, he was witnessing the whole rise of Nazism after those elections in 1933.
Correct. His bar mitzvah was in October 38. Sorry, 23, October 36, apologies. And in the shul where his father and uncle were the big machas, the big cheeses. And he wore his shorts. He was very proud to tell us in those days a bar mitzvah boy wore shorts, and even though he was 6 foot, he was still very proudly wearing his shorts. And yes, he had a regular bar mitzvah like his other friends, and it was just a regular Jewish Orthodox life growing up there, even in 36, the year of his bar mitzvah.
Wow. Okay, so fast forwarding a couple of years after that, so he would have been 14, 15 years old. What actually did he witness on Kristallnacht, and how did he describe how that night changed the life of your family and so many others?
It not only changed the life of the family, it changed his life in one very strictly one chance of a change of a lifetime, which was this. They heard the screaming, my father and his sister. So they went up to the roof of their flat, and from there they had a vista of Germany, Berlin in particular, on fire. And only later in that evening did they realize that the only buildings being burnt were shuls and Jewish community centers and schools. And by seeing that, that was one part of it. But then they would hear the rioters, the thousands of rioters, going from flat enclave to flat enclave, screaming in German, "Are there any Jews living here?" And they could hear the non-Jewish residents of these buildings shouting yes and giving them what flat numbers. And then they would hear screaming. And my father said to us, that was the first and last time he was afraid. He never felt fear after that. And he and his sister sort of moved back on that roof, moved a bit back to a wall as if this will make them safer. And miraculously, even though they were the only Jewish family in their building, when the rioters came to the courtyard of that building and shouted, "Are there any Jews here?" in German, every single neighbor screamed out, "No." Many reasons. One, because my father played rugby with all the other teenagers in that building, and they knew that without him, their rugby games wouldn't be the same. And number two, they were just very, very nice people. My father and his sister, and of course their mother and father, were very lucky. And the rioters just moved on to the next building.
Wow, my goodness. What amazing bravery also from those other people in the building. And what an impact your family evidently made on them. Gosh. Okay, so your father and your aunt, they're witnessing their own shul as well as the others building. And I remember your father speaking about this a little bit in Berlin, seeing the shul opposite where he lived, if I remember correctly, but burning. How then did your family manage to escape? And how did your father in particular rebuild his life afterwards?
Dr. Solomon Schonfeld, the orchestrator of the Kindertransport and the founder of the Jewish secondary school movement, otherwise known as Hasmonean, he arranged for thousands of young Jewish children to be shipped by train from Berlin and other places to the United Kingdom before the outbreak of war. My father, luckily, was one of those children, and he left his parents on May the 30th, 1939, on his father's 45th birthday. He said goodbye to his parents, aged 15 and a half, and he never saw them again. His sister Miriam was deported back to Lodz, where she spent a few months with her family, who she'd never met before, and had a wonderful time as an 11-year-old with her cousins. And eventually she too was shipped over with a Kindertransport over to London. My father was taken to a boarding school in Scotland, and his sister, my aunt, was taken as a char girl to a non-Jewish house in Hemel Hempstead, who had answered an advert in the Times, anyone wanting free labor on return, having them to live in your house. So my Aunt Miriam was a char girl at that tender age in these people's houses, and my father went to a boarding school in Scotland for the first 2 or 3 years until he was asked to join either the Polish army, because he was Polish, or the British army. So he asked, which serves better kosher food? And they said, the British army. And if you know my family, that is the only question he was going to ask. And he joined the British army. He became a sergeant major. And up until 1941-42, he was still receiving letters from his parents via the Red Cross. But then those letters stopped. And it was around about that time that he figured his parents who were sent back to Lodz were killed. We don't know exactly where or when. There are different stories. And my father, during the British Army, was stationed one weekend in Buckinghamshire for a Bachad weekend where the Jewish soldiers would have time off. He met my mother there. She was a land girl working. Her family had managed to come to Britain before the outbreak of war from Frankfurt, all with South African passports. That's a different story. And they met and they married in December 44. And they had 7 children, of which I am the very, very youngest.
Wow, gosh, what an amazing story. And to be able to despite all the dislocation coming to a foreign land, not speaking the language, to be able to rebuild in that way. Think of your father as a rugby player as well. Gosh, this is to think of that significance in his story. So your parents married, and of course they set up home in the UK, in Letchworth, amongst other places, and eventually they moved to Israel. How did your father speak to you and others about his experiences? Was it something which you found easy to talk about? Was it something which was difficult? How, in terms of your family, did he communicate this incredible story to you?
He was very, very mindful of bringing up a family in a normal family atmosphere. And therefore, anything which he would think would tip the balance of a happy family, you could see he would never do. If outsiders came to him and said, can we interview you? He would sit down for hours on end. He did a Holocaust institution interview for 6 hours. And for the family to want to know what happened, we'd have to listen to that, because he would never, sit down and physically start retelling anything. Every now and then he'd have a memory and say, like, for example, he remembers in May 1944, he was training the front line for D-Day. He himself couldn't go to the front line because he had a strong German accent, and the British Army were worried that he'd be shot dead as a spy. And it was in the middle of the night that he is training these troops in a ravine. And next to him is another Orthodox Jewish friend of his, not a sergeant major, but Corporal Manfred Landau. And he said to Manfred, Manfred, today's Hebrew date is Shavuot. And as you know, Rabbi Laitner, on Shavuot, there's a Jewish tradition to stay up all night. And my father said to Manfred, it's 2 a.m. and we're awake. Our parents would be proud. And it was those sort of stories that my father would retell. But the one about him saying he was only scared once in his life on Kristallnacht, he happened to tell that to us in his 90th year, just one Friday evening, talking about being scared. But it's not part of a narrative that he would share with us, because he wanted to rebuild. His and my mother's vow was to rebuild from the past, but not remembering the past or having to force the past onto their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And now, can I just say, great-great-grandchildren.
Wow, Baruch Hashem. Wow. Gosh, and that awareness of Shavuot, and to think of the story in that way, it is very, very striking. And I suppose it leads us on to considering what did being Jewish and the state of Israel in particular, given it was founded in 1948, and what that meant to people that had lived before the war, through the war, and were now rebuilding after the war. What did that mean to your father? I mean, if there's a way even of summarizing that, must have meant an enormous amount. But what do you think really, in essence, it meant to your father?
I can tell it to you in one paragraph. My father was a forward thinker. And at the age of 9, even though he went to the Adas Cheder and was taught Comets Aleph R, Comets Base Bar, he was an ardent Zionist, and he taught himself to read in the modern Hebrew way, Baruch Atah, from the age 9. The rebbes of his cheder went to complain to his parents, saying, "What is Eli doing? What is this modernische Zach he's doing?" My father was a Zionist before the age of 10. It's as simple as that, Rabbi Laitner. And
Wow.
moving to England was just for him a stepping stone to move to Israel. And my parents would have gone in 1950, a year and a half after Israel's establishment, if not for one of my siblings being a bit sadly problematic with the air in Israel, with his asthma. But otherwise, you would have been talking to a kibbutznik right now, also wearing shorts in the long family tradition. In the north of Israel, many German, British Jews went there, and my parents were going to join them. And finally, their dream came true in 1990, and my parents lived there. They bought already a flat in the 70s, but they lived there together from 1990 for 20 plus years, nearly 30 years, until their passing. My father was an ardent Zionist. For him, Zionism, Judaism was one.
Wow, that is remarkable, especially thinking that context before the war. And gosh, thinking what your family has done for British Jewry, Israel's loss during those years was certainly British Jewry's gain. But how wonderful for them, they had that time in Israel and were able to realize that dream. I suppose then in closing, what do you think, given your father's life experiences, and particularly that sense of Zionism, that he would have said to people today, if we still had, and I wish we did, the opportunity to turn around and say, Mr. Fachler, we're living in awful, incomprehensible times. What would you say, both to Jews and more broadly, as we struggle with this situation in Israel today?
You're asking a very good question. And I'm not trying to say that because all your questions have been amazing, but this one is exceptionally good because there are only 5 of us remaining, 1 sister and 4 brothers. And the 4 brothers, every single Friday, we have a group chat, live group chat, FaceTime. And the first thing that came to our minds when the horror of October the 7th was unfolding was, we need Dad. We need his guidance. He always, without having to think, would say the right thing because his mind was he was such a clear thinker from a very early age. And you could never sway him because once he had an idea, that was it. And it was normally the correct idea. So when we finally got together the first Friday after the horror, we were asking ourselves, number one, what would Dad say? But maybe more sadly, where is Dad, for us to ask him? And he was very pragmatic. He fully understood the idea of too much pain and suffering is bad for the soul. And whatever is happening, one has to realize how much can your body take it. And if it's too much, you need to somehow move on. Whatever you're doing, of course, your mind and heart is always in the situation. But physically and emotionally, you need to say to yourself, this is terrible. This is awful. This is tragic. We are not here to be paid to think of solutions. We are here to live. He was very into uvacharta b'chayim, and you choose life. So whatever he would have suggested, it would have been something to do with the living. And we use that mantra. And every now and then, we would try and maybe share, a quip, a joke, something to get some way, sort of an escape from the reality, because the reality is there and it's not going anywhere for a long time, unfortunately. My father had many solutions, which he would never say out loud, because some of the things he might have got arrested for, even nowadays. But that was him, and someone who's been through what he has been through, I think one can give him permission to have those ideas. He's seen what rhetoric can do. He's seen the power of Goebbels. So he knows how PR wins over so many, even intelligent voices. So he's seen all that. He's not swayed by that. But his movement his idea is take it as much as you can, not too much, because you need to live, and then do what you can to continue living in whatever circumstance. That's how he lasted into his 10th decade, managing to see children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren.
Wow. Gosh, what a very powerful mixture of inspirational, historical, and thought-provoking material. And also for telling me things, despite being one of your students for many years, which I didn't know about your father and the influence on his family. I think it just emphasizes to us that when thinking of people like your late parents and those of their generation, with all that they went through and then managed to accomplish, we are blessed to be standing on the shoulders of such great people, and to be able to take their messages and apply them today is very comforting. So I think we can conclude by saying that the lessons of Kristallnacht, sadly, are still keenly relevant today. The messages which your fathers and others managed to pass on to us are very important for us. We continue to hope and pray, please God, for better times ahead, and that God will bless us and the whole world with that greatest of blessings, the blessing of peace.
Amen.
So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Rabbi.
We wish you continued hatzlacha, continued success to you and all of your family in the wonderful endeavors which you undertake for the sake of the Jewish people.
Thank you.